A debate that my brother and I used to get into often was about who was the better superhero. I remember one of our debates where he said, "Oh, it's for sure Superman. Definitely. It has to be. Superman has every ability." And I had my doubts because kryptonite was just so weakening for Superman. And he kept running into it. Anybody who knows the comics knows. He was always being threatened by kryptonite. And so I felt like I just don't know if he's really the one I want to back. I remember in one of those debates, I chose Aquaman, and my brother made so much fun of me for that. He said, he can't do anything. But I said, when we got in the pool one day, who's the superhero now? I always felt like Aquaman could swim away from anything, whereas these other superheroes would have their hard time. Superman can't fly in water. And I think we still have this fascination with adult superheroes. Adults usually don't care about those comic book characters, but we care about people who are rich, people who are famous, people who are extraordinarily beautiful. Reality shows draw us in. We love having superheroes in our culture. The thing that is very interesting for us on the Feast of All Saints is to recognize the relationship between the virtues that God gives us to practice and deep joy that lasts forever, and to contrast that with all of the gifts that we receive by focusing on wealth and beauty and power and seeing how they diminish over time. When we compare the gifts that the saints had with the gifts that the rich, the famous, and the beautiful have, we see an inverse relationship. There's no comparison. If we take the things that really excite us in our culture, we find that true wisdom tells us, don't pursue that, it's not going to work out. There are very few of us who have not, at least at some point in our life, gotten caught up in the pursuit of money. That's very typical for anyone. Of course, wouldn't it be nice to have all the resources that we need to do whatever we like? But my uncle, when I was a child, once said to me when we were stopped for a funeral procession that was driving through the streets of Troy, he said, "Scotty, take a look at that. There's no Brinks trunk behind that hearse, is there? There's no U-Haul. Remember that. You don't take any of it with you." Money will not help us at all in the end. If we were to receive a diagnosis that we had a terminal illness today, what would money do for us? What comfort would it be if we were in a hospice bed right now, if we were in that bed in a beautiful palace or in a small trailer? What difference would it make? How about fame? I'm a child of the 90s. When I was growing up, the cast of Beverly Hills 90210 was the supreme group of role models for my generation. And I can't think of any of them who are really famous now. I remember some of their names, Jason Priestley, but he's just one of a long list of people who lost their fame because life marches on. No one really talks too much about Kirk Cameron or the music of Belinda Carlisle anymore. Fame is not something to pursue. It dries up, it blows away. You know, my favorite of all of them, though, is looks. Many of us just have such admiration for the very good looking. You know, we look at people who win pageants and we look at celebrities whose fame came because of their great looks, and we just feel in awe. Gosh, to be that beautiful. I remember a quote, though, once from Joan Collins, who was for a time seen in our culture as extraordinarily beautiful. And she said, "Being good looking is actually a very bad deal." She said, "It's like being born rich and getting poorer throughout your life." Isn't that true? If we place our hope in looks, we know what direction that's going. God has designed life that way. Anything earthly, anything material, anything within time that we put our hope in will diminish. Material gifts diminish the more you use them. If you have $100, the more of it you spend, the less you'll have in your wallet. But spiritual gifts are the opposite. There's an inverse relationship with spiritual gifts. They grow the more you use them. Spiritual gifts increase in their value as you use them. And that's why we hear this gospel, the famous Beatitudes, every All Saints' Day, to remind us that what looks weak to the world is exactly what helps us persevere through the challenges of life. Jesus is elevating the merciful, those who don't hold grudges or try to have power over others. He exalts the resilient, those who can go through very hard times and not lose their faith. He exalts the meek, the people who don't need to be the center of attention in order to know what their identity is. And he exalts the poor in spirit, the opposite of those people who are pursuing wealth and status. He says to be poor in spirit is to open up the gates of heaven. When I was brand new to being pastor of our two churches, I met a woman who had a huge impact on me. She only lived for my first 2 weeks here. I celebrated her funeral at the end of my first month here in town. She lived in Ravenna, but many people here know her too because she was a longtime waitress at the Quarry. And her name was Mary Tiberia. As she was dying, she talked to me about what she had learned in life. And she was somebody who had really succeeded at living a joyful life despite a lot of hardships. And what she said to me in that hospital room was so beautiful, I wrote it down before I walked out. I left and went in the hallway, wrote this down because I knew that I would want to remember it. Here's what she said to me. One of the greatest gifts that God has given me is the gift to be satisfied with very little. She said, I don't need to travel. I don't need to buy things. I just like Ravenna and all of my friends and my family here. And then she pointed at me and she said, that's a gift, you know. That's a great gift. And she died a week later. The good news of All Saints' Day is none of these people had superpowers. None of them. Some of them had gifts, but those gifts were given by the same God who gives us gifts. And we are called to follow in their footsteps, to find a way to be resilient through all the storms of life, to make our way step by step. The great Nelson Mandela, who was the champion of freedom in South Africa, who was in jail for almost 30 years for crimes he didn't commit, was once hailed by a woman in a crowd. She said, "You are a living saint." And he said, "No, I'm not a saint. Unless, by saint, you mean a sinner who keeps on trying."